Hello and welcome to this very special edition of the Middle East Report as we look back at some of the key events that shaped Israel and the Middle East in 2013. And this is a reminder of what happened this year. So to discuss the news review of 2013, I'm joined by Dermot, Chief Executive of BICOM. Dermot, it's great to have you back on the Middle East Report. So the first question I'll ask you, how has 2013 been for you and BICOM?
Hi Simon, and I'm delighted to be back. Well, it's been a busy year, and I'm sure, as we'll see later in the programme, it's been a very eventful time in Israel and the whole region. The year started in a difficult place. You may remember at the end of 2012, there was the Operation Pillar of Defence in Gaza. Israel had been under sustained rocket attack for much of 2012. So we started the year with a very, very heavy heart. But as we'll find out, it's been a very, very eventful year, and there's been some real signs of hope in Israel.
And so really, if we start with January 2013, I think the key event for Israel was Israel's general election, in which the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu of the Likud party, has won his third consecutive term in office, but we also saw the rise of Yesh Atid. Can you discuss something about the importance of this election in Israel?
Well, indeed, and although the Prime Minister stayed the same, actually there was a lot of change went on underneath in terms of the Knesset itself. There was a rise of the centre, Yesh Atid, as you said, party which grew significantly, and there's also a rise of the Jewish Home Party to the right. A couple of interesting things, unique things about this election. First of all, this was the first election in Israel's history that wasn't dominated by the security question. It was dominated by social and economic issues, and that was interesting of itself. And this is the first government for decades that hasn't included the Orthodox parties, for example, Shas, which normally form part of the coalition. For those two reasons, it's quite a unique election.
And we've got a news clip to go to now that looks at Israel's general election that took place in January 2013.
Israeli election results are now all but official, with some 99.8% of the votes being counted, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud Beitenu political alliance have come out as the largest party with 31 seats. But shocking Israel has been a surge by the Yesh Atid party that came in second. Election results are showing a near deadlock between right-wing and center-left blocs. Although Netanyahu will have the first chance to form a coalition government, the even split between the left, center and right will most likely force the Prime Minister to form a broad coalition across the political spectrum. The newest political party on the scene, Yesh Atid, or There Is a Future, surprised everyone by taking 19 seats, making it the second largest party in parliament. Led by former journalist and TV personality Yair Lapid, the centrist left Yesh Atid was only formed last year and won votes on a platform of social reform and promised to abolish military exemptions for Jewish seminary students. Opinion on the street is mixed, with some in support of Benjamin Netanyahu's re-election and others glad that his power has waned considerably.
Something will not going to change, so I don't believe that something changed with the Palestinian.
I was surprised. I did not expect such results, but I'm quite content because I do not support Bibi.
People wanted a change, and the vote's outcome is a no to the past and a yes to the future.
I hope Netanyahu will drop more and more in the polls, and with God's help, the left and Shas will rise and strengthen, and a real change will come to the people in Israel. It's about time to bring down capitalism. It's about time to have affordable and social housing for everyone.
We will have a very good government. Bibi will be the Prime Minister.
With Benjamin Netanyahu's power greatly reduced, he has offered to form an alliance with Yair Lapid. However, Lapid has said he will only be willing to join a coalition committed to reviving the peace process with the Palestinians, which has stalled since Netanyahu took office. Professor David Ricci of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem thinks such negotiations will resume after a coalition is formed.
Netanyahu will not form a moderate government. Netanyahu will form a government that's patched together from a great many different parts of the spectrum, the right mainly, a little bit from the center. It won't be a moderate government, but it will be compelled, I think, by international pressure to reopen negotiations. I think the President of the United States is very interested in that. European community is very interested in that.
However, Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza are less optimistic that any change will stem from the Israeli elections.
Whether the Israeli cabinet is either left or right, that wouldn't change anything, especially towards the Palestinian peace process.
Israel has the same policies, even if the cabinet was left or right. It is clear that the Israeli policies towards the Palestinians are the same. It is suppression policies and racist policies.
In a sign that times are changing, though, this election saw 26 women, the most ever, elected to the Israeli parliament of 120 seats. These fresh faces, who make up more than 1/5 of the Knesset, may be able to bring a fresh perspective on the Palestinian situation, which has grown stale in recent years.
As we saw in that clip there, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu won an historic third term in office. It's some achievement, isn't it, for an Israeli Prime Minister to win 3 terms?
It is. It's unprecedented. And in fact, Time magazine had a photograph of him on the front cover saying King Bibi, which which I believe he has a copy of framed in his office. It is unprecedented. And during the election, Bibi Netanyahu was the only serious candidate for the job of Prime Minister, and that was borne out in the results. But also, as you saw in that video, Israel has a very vibrant democratic culture. People are allowed to speak freely, even calling for the end of capitalism and the arrival of socialism. And it also has one of the purest forms of proportional representation, PR. Although personally not a fan, means that the number of parties represented in the Knesset are, it's very large. There are literally dozens of parties represented, and they form very broad coalitions.
So one of the major issues we've also faced in 2013 has been the issue to do with Syria and the Syrian civil war, which is clearly one of the biggest crises facing the Middle East. And there's been various concerns that the Iranians have been supplying missiles and weapons and supporting the regime of President Bashar al-Assad against the rebels. And there's a great danger that some of the chemical biological weapons could fall into the hands of Hezbollah.
No, very much, Simon, you are right. There is the Iranian regime both supports Assad and Hezbollah, which is the terrorist organization in southern Lebanon, and there's an arc of influence from the Gulf through to the Mediterranean, and this is obviously very worrying and concerning to Israel. But the so-called Syrian civil war has ground on throughout 2013, as it did 2012, with increasingly horrific. And as you mentioned, the chemical attacks on civilians, which happened this year, were just horrific is the only word I can think of. But it's part of a plan for Iranian influence within the region, and they are arming Assad, and they are backing him, and there are revolutionary guards, Iranian revolutionary guards in Syria, as well as Hezbollah militia fighting on the side of Assad.
And we got a news clip, and this is alleged that Israeli airstrikes to attack convoys on their way to the Islamist terrorist organization Hezbollah.
As yet unnamed U.S. and Israeli officials have reportedly said that Israeli warplanes late last week carried out an airstrike targeting a shipment of missiles from Syria bound for Hezbollah guerrillas in neighboring Lebanon. Israel has long made clear that it is ready to resort to force to prevent advanced Syrian weapons, including President Bashar al-Assad's reputed chemical arsenal, reaching his Hezbollah allies, or Islamist rebels taking part in a more than 2-year-old uprising against his government. Hezbollah, allied with Israel's archenemy Iran, waged an inconclusive war with the Jewish state in 2006 and remains a potent threat in Israeli eyes. The militant group opposes the West and Israel and seeks to create in Lebanon an Islamic state modeled on Iran. It primarily operates in the Shiite-dominated areas of southern Beirut, southern Lebanon, and the Bekaa Valley. Israelis also worry that if Assad is toppled, Islamist rebels could turn his guns on them after 4 decades of relative calm in the Golan Heights border area. The exact target of last week's air raid remains unclear, but the Israeli Air Force possesses so-called standoff bombs that coast dozens of kilometers across ground to their targets once fired. Israel remains technically at war with neighboring Syria. It captured Syria's Golan Heights in the 1967 Middle East War, built settlements, and annexed the land. Yet belligerence was rare, and the borderland has remained largely quiet for decades. Israeli security concerns have risen since Islamist fighters linked to al-Qaeda assumed a prominent role in the insurrection against Assad. They have also worried that Hezbollah could eventually obtain his chemical arsenal and other advanced weaponry.
And the situation in Syria remains a major crisis for the international community to actually deal with, and our hearts and prayers must go out to the people of Syria caught up in the violence and the civil war. Not a very easy situation, and Israel's doing all that it can to help support those Syrians caught up from either side who come into Israel's territory to nurse them back to health. We're going on to March now of 2003, Dermot, and one of the key events of March 2003 was President Obama's official state visit. So I think the first time that he visited Israel as president of the United States, and trying to cement the Israeli-American relationship. How important was his visit to Israel in March?
It was very important. It was the first visit that Obama did as president, first state visit, after he got re-elected, and just following the Israeli elections. The Israeli-American relationship is a very important one. And the visit itself, I thought, was quite inspirational and quite moving. He culminated the visit with a speech to a hall of Israeli students in Tel Aviv, and gave what I believe to be one of the best articulations of the case for the two-state solution that I've heard. There's always talk. There's talk again this year. There was talk last year about strains in the Israeli-US relationship, but it's such a vitally important one, and it was seen and appreciated by Israelis that Obama came and chose Israel as his first visit.
So we got this cartoon, and this is the Israeli government talking about the importance of the relationship between the United States and the State of Israel.
Warmly welcome President Obama to Israel. Express our appreciation for what he has done for Israel.
The bonds between the United States and Israel are unbreakable, and the commitment of the United States to the security of Israel is ironclad.
Thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again. Your heart is true. You're a pal. Thank you for being a friend.
And it just shows you there in that clip the importance of Israel's strategic relationship with the United States. But there has been a lot of tension, Dermot, particularly with the Israeli government and the United States, probably more so than any other president during Israel's 65 years as being an independent established state in the Middle East. Primarily issues such as Iran and Iran's nuclear program that Israel sees a difference, but also the United States policy in supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and what Israel considers enemies to the State of Israel has created a lot of tension between the two countries, despite the fact there's still military, very, very strong alliance between the two.
No, you're right, Sam. The military alliance is very strong, and also strategically. I mean, America sees Israel as a country that shares its values, and as a democracy in the Middle East. And as President Obama said, that remains ironclad. However, it's been a very difficult time in the Middle East. I think it's been a difficult time for policymakers in the West, and the Americans not least, and in terms of dealing with the situation in Egypt. And also in Syria, there's a trend in Western countries, the UK and the US, away, for example, from intervention, following what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade. However, in Syria, we see the consequences of non-intervention. If you don't intervene, problems don't go away, they only get worse as well. So I think the American administration has struggled to respond to developments in the Middle East and the Arab world, where some of its long-time allies have either fallen or become destabilized. And I think that has inevitably led to tensions with Israel, who's sitting slap bang in the middle of the whole thing.
And if we look at April now of 2013, one of the major events that occurred in April was how the UN believed that Assad's forces had used chemical and biological weapons against his own people, which is in convention to the Geneva Convention on Conduct of Warfare. And the response by the British government was that David Cameron decided to have a vote in the House of Commons in which Parliament said no to any military intervention, and Obama did the same. But wasn't there a great danger that the red lines drawn up by President Obama in the United States, that Assad should not use chemical or biological weapons against his own people, if breached, would have an American response? Surely that damaged America's credibility and power, as well as Britain's, in the Middle East.
I think you're right. I mean, it's important that the first reports of chemical weapons use was in April. The vote in the Commons didn't come till after the summer recess in September, I believe. It took a very long time. They were very reluctant. I watched that debate very closely, and I sat in the Strangers' Gallery, and what was quite concerning for me, I think, was that indecision. I think a lot of the thinking around what to do in Syria was informed about lessons people had drawn, rightly or wrongly, from the Iraq conflict. And I think the decision not to enforce very clear, and it's not just red lines from America, these are global norms. I mean, the use of chemical weapons against civilians is something the world has said since the First World War. This is not a morally acceptable way for people to behave, for states to behave. And that, by and large, the use of chemical weapons has been minimal. I mean, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times regimes have used chemical weapons since the First World War. That is worth preserving. Now, I think despite the vote in the House of Commons and pulling back from that action, hopefully it looks like things are happening in Syria, and those chemical stockpiles will be removed and destroyed. But I think it reminds us the need to look very carefully at what's happening. As much as we may wish to not intervene or to move on and not get involved in trouble around the world, if you don't get involved, it doesn't make it go away. Things get worse and deteriorate further. And I think in Syria, from April, from the first use, when it was a minor use and it was reported and so on, up until the summer when he thought he could act with impunity. And hundreds were murdered in the most vile way possible.
And we got a news clip on that one entitled McCain Calls for Action Over Assad's Chemical Weapons.
Scenes like these, with Syrians clutching their throats, seem to suggest that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons. That's what the White House recently said, and the announcement has ratcheted up pressure on President Obama to take hard action. Congressional Republicans have said that Obama must stick to his vow to intervene if Syria has in fact used chemical weapons. Leading the Republican charge has been Senator John McCain, who appeared on NBC's Meet the Press and outlined how the United States needs to intervene in Syria.
A safe zone, arming the rebels, making sure that we help with the refugees and be prepared with an international force to go in and secure these stocks of chemical and perhaps biological weapons. There are a number of caches of these chemical weapons. They cannot fall into the hands of the jihadists, otherwise we will end up seeing those weapons used in other places in the Middle East. It's
and U.S. troops should be part of that force?
Situation. I don't know. I think that, first of all, American people are weary, as you pointed out. They don't want boots on the ground. I don't want boots on the ground. I do want to give them the assistance which would give them a dramatic shift in the balance of power in Syria.
As an increasing number of hardline Islamists join the ranks of the rebels fighting Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the U.S., Israel, and other regional powers are concerned that if Assad is overthrown, his stockpile of weapons could fall into the wrong hands.
The conventional weapons, if they get loose from Syria, and there are a bunch of them, is incredibly destabilizing to the Levant, to the Middle East, to Southern Europe. That's why Israel is concerned, Jordan is concerned, Turkey is concerned, because they see that in chaos, when he falls, you have Hezbollah in the north trying to get their hands on both chemical and conventional weapons. You have Al-Qaeda all over the country now, even knocking on Israel's doorstep in the south, also looking to get better equipped through these stockpiles. It is horribly destabilizing, but that's why they need to take a leadership role.
But some Democrats argue that the U.S. needs to remember the invasion of Iraq in 2003 that was based on faulty intelligence and that Washington cannot make the same mistake again.
You know, we've had a little problem with going to the UN with the idea of weapons of mass destruction before, so we certainly want to finish the investigation. But he said it's not an on and off switch, but it has changed his calculation. And of course, he's looking into all of the options. But, you know, to imply that maybe we're not doing enough or we're not doing anything, I think is also a mistake.
The rebels have claimed the Assad regime has used chemical weapons at least 4 times since December, and as video footage and evidence continues to surface about the nature of attacks in Syria, the international community may have to make some tough decisions very soon.
And I'm very much sure that Syria is very much going to dominate our headlines in 2014. Dermot, we're now on to May of this year, and I think probably one of the most shocking news events I've seen in a very, very long time was the horrendous killing of the soldier drummer Lee Rigby, where he had his head chopped off in the streets of London, which really kind of brought so many of the issues that Israel and the Middle East have to deal with to our own very doorsteps here in London.
Indeed, and this is one of the occasions where words almost fail. I mean, you say it was horrendous, it was horrific. I'm sure you remember, like me, watching that news story unfold. I live in London, I'm a Londoner, and that someone can be run over and hacked to death in this fashion was truly shocking. I mean, and one of the things that I thought at the time was people were calling this a terrorist attack and all the rest of it. I don't think you can even dignify it by calling it terrorist, however terrible that is. This was a criminal, barbaric act by individuals who have no excuse for their behaviour whatsoever. It was cowardly. You know, and it didn't cause terror. It just caused shock and revulsion, and a sense of shared grief for Lee Rigby's family. But you're right. What happens elsewhere in the Middle East, and as we saw later in the year in parts of Africa, it does come back on our shores if in this sort of twisted logic that somehow you're serving some higher purpose by choosing out an individual at random and hacking him with meat cleavers. I mean, it was the pictures and the images and the act itself caused nothing but revulsion.
One thing that shocked me, I suppose, the most about the horrendous murder of drummer Lee Rigby, not only did this happen in broad daylight, but it was the media coverage afterwards that concerned me the most. I mean, serious questions should have been raised by our politicians and by the media. I'm saying, what could it possibly be that actually motivates someone or inspires someone to actually convert from Christianity to Islam, and then to be prepared to actually chop a soldier's head off in broad daylight without looking at the whole ideology of extremist Islam in this country, and for the government to do more to stop this incitement and hatred that we're seeing not only in the Middle East but sadly now here in Britain.
I think you're entirely right. I mean, another big issue of the year, which would take a whole other programme, has been media behaviour and media responsibility. But I mean, you're right. In terms of incitement, this has to be taken seriously. It has to be taken more seriously. There are things that can be done, but it shouldn't be either excused or indulged in any way. We have, I mean, also the other side of the coin from the horrific images and which the media broadcast was how the people standing by reacted. I mean, there were a party of school children who were hurried away, but some of the women, there were women who were going by who intervened, who kept the murderers, away from other people, kept talking to them before the police arrived. There were acts of women who consoled Lee Rigby as he lay dying, and kept again the two murderers away from his body, and just acts of human bravery and human kindness and human spirit, which can make us proud. And it's almost to see both those human characteristics and what is it that can turn someone, what ideology could justify, and you called him a soldier. He happened to be a soldier. At the time, he was a man walking down the street in a T-shirt that said "Help for Heroes." That's why they targeted him. They didn't know he wasn't serving. He was a man walking down a London street in broad daylight, and I think if that's not taken seriously and it's not going away, we'll talk later about Syria, I think, and possibly Africa. People who go away and join these jihadi groups come back to the UK.
And as a reminder of this horrific terrorist attack, the killing of drummer Lee Rigby in the streets of London, we've got a news clip to go to now.
Flowers at the scene where the British soldier died near the Woolwich Army Barracks in southeast London. The victim was 25-year-old drummer Lee Rigby, who was serving with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. He leaves behind a 2-year-old son. Police are still trying to establish what happened on Wednesday afternoon. Witnesses say 2 men used a car to run down the victim, whom they then attacked with knives and a machete, shouting "Allahu Akbar, God is great." Around 20 minutes later, an armed response unit arrived and shot the men, but not before one of the suspects was filmed by a passer-by justifying his actions.
I apologise that women had to witness this today, but in our land, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your governments, they don't care about you.
The killing sparked a terror alert with suspicions raised that this was a possible jihadist attack. One of the alleged killers is reportedly 28-year-old Michael Adebolajo, British but of Nigerian descent.
So you can all live in peace.
Muslim leaders in the UK have strongly condemned the attack, declaring it was not carried out in the name of Islam.
What we've seen is a ratcheting up of tensions. We've seen hysteria about Muslims and Islam, fear and hatred and xenophobia against foreigners and immigrants. And in that political cauldron and in that vacuum, these kind of sparks can cause real damage, and that is the danger, that communities do not turn on themselves.
But as police investigate whether the killing was part of a wider terrorist plot or carried out by so-called lone wolves, there have already been 2 attacks on mosques in the southeast of England. The British National Party has issued anti-immigration statements, and last night members of the far-right English Defence League clashed with police.
Enough's enough. Our message is enough. We have weak leaders, weak police. Our police and our leaders tiptoe around this issue. This issue is political Islam. It's political Islam that's spreading across this country.
As we saw in that clip there, that our hearts must go out and our prayers must go out to the family of drummer Lee Rigby, who is suffering incredible grief as the trial of the 2 terrorists is currently going on. We're on to June now, Dermot, in 2003, and I suppose one of the biggest and probably most surprising events of the year was the election of Rouhani, the new proclaimed moderate who won the Iranian presidential elections, which really did shift Iran's relationship with the West, and it seemed to very much isolate Israel on the very important issue of Iran's nuclear weapons program.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think we should use the term election advisedly here. Of course, the only people allowed to stand are people approved by the Supreme Leader. So the range of candidates is very narrow, and moderate is a relative term. So I wouldn't see him as being that moderate. But he did present a different face to the West and to America in particular. His predecessor, Ahmadinejad, who was a Holocaust denier and had frequently called for the destruction of Israel, had done Iran no favours. So, and from that election, we then saw a change in presentation from Iran, and what we still don't know, but we'll find out in 2014, is whether there's any change of substance. Israel is for understandable reasons quite sceptical, although he's been elected president. There's still the person who runs the country is the supreme leader. There's a clue in his name. He is the supreme leader, and he's not changed. Neither of his has his views. So Israel has been very concerned that what we may be seeing in Iran is merely a change of window dressing, maybe all fine words but no action. But in 2014, Iran's bluff will be called, and we'll need to see if they're serious about dismantling the military program or not.
And we've got a news clip now as Israel reacts to the election of President Rouhani in Iran.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned the international community against easing sanctions on Iran following the election of a reformist-backed president. Netanyahu said Iran's government is effectively unchanged, with decisions on key issues such as foreign affairs and nuclear development still solidly in the hands of ruling clerics and the Revolutionary Guard, who are committed to the destruction of the Jewish state. Israeli President Shimon Peres, however, sounded one of the few notes of cautious praise for the election of Hassan Rouhani, saying the widespread support of the moderate cleric showed a desire for change on the Iranian streets, an increasing will among Iranian people to redirect their country's politics away from confrontation with the West. In his first national television address as president-elect, Rouhani said he would defend Iranian national interests once in office and called on his political opponents to lay aside their disagreements for the good of the country.
And you can be sure that the Iranian nuclear weapons program will dominate our news headlines in 2014, and we should really wake up to the deception that the Western world seemed to be in with the election of President Rouhani and this sign of moderation on behalf of the Iranian regime. We have to judge them by their fruits, and as we look at their support for international terrorism, that's not abating. Their abuse of human rights haven't stopped. So all we've seen is a change of face and a change of tactics rather than actual change of regime. Dermot, I think we're also discussing some other issues that occurred in July. Now, we had two major issues that really shocked the Middle East. And the first one was the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood president, President Morsi, by General Sisi, and also the 30+ million people who took to the streets over the rise of Islamification and the empowerment of the Muslim Brotherhood on the people of Egypt.
And indeed, it was remarkable to see. And as you point out, what I found very remarkable was when they were talking to people on the streets, the degree to which, as you say, the Islamification of Egypt against the will of the people was a major part of the reason for ousting the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I hope to see Egypt return to constitutional democracy, but democracy is about more than just majority rule. It's not about imposing your will. And the Muslim Brotherhood had governed so spectacularly badly in a very, very short space of time. They turned the people of the country against them, who you know, it's a strong Muslim country. These people are good Muslims, but the Islamification which they saw from the Morsi government simply wasn't something that they voted for or wanted, and millions of people took to the streets in a remarkable display of people power. And as you say, he's now been ousted, and we remain to see. It's gone a bit quieter in Egypt, and hopefully in 2014 we'll see some proper elections.
And we got a news clip to remind you of the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood president Morsi days before his first year in office.
central Cairo erupted into scenes of celebration following the ousting of President Morsi. Fireworks and flags were in abundance, with cheers and the chanting of pro-army slogans from those who had camped out in Tahrir Square since Sunday. This is the happiest day of my life because Morsi has left. He's a traitor, and I will now forget his name because he didn't do anything good for me or for the country. Our correspondent in Tahrir Square says the military intervention resolved the political dispute which Egypt had suffered from since Morsi took power. The intervention has achieved the wishes of the demonstrators here, but the other side read it as a soft military coup which may push the country for a third time into conflict. Shock and bitter disappointment quickly turned to anger among Morsi supporters as they learned of his removal. Over 50% of Egyptians had voted for him and the Muslim Brotherhood 1 year ago. The legitimacy is with President Morsi, and we will die for the sake of him. He came via the ballot box, then he must leave via the ballot box, not by force. What is the use of an election and democracy? Analysts are saying with the population now deeply divided, the next 48 hours could be significant as those who feel betrayed decide how to respond.
And in August of 2013, we saw horrendous, brutal attacks on the Christian community in Egypt, particularly the Coptic community who've been there that predate Islam in Egypt, which we saw over 68 churches, monasteries, Christian bookshops burnt down and destroyed by supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And yet the Egyptian Christians face their own Krishtonat. But yet there was very little international condemnation nor media coverage on this one. We have to move on because I think we're kind of running out of time a little bit, Dermot. But in August 2013, we saw the restarting of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. I know because we did a program together on this issue, in which Israel has to pay a high price to even enter into negotiations with the release of 104 Palestinian prisoners with blood on their hands.
Indeed, and it is a high price to pay. These people are convicted criminals in the courts. Many of them are murderers, and this has been a difficult decision for the Israeli government and has been a painful one for the Israeli people. But that was the first of a number of waves. There's the next wave is due to go out just before New Year's Eve this year, where another tranche will also be released. However, the resumption of the talks is a good thing. It is always better for people to be talking than not talking. The Americans are very intently involved in this as well. There's a 9-month deadline on these talks, so halfway during next year we should see some outcome of some kind. So it's very much to be welcomed that the people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, are back in a room together, and it is to be hoped that a real, genuine peace that allows Israel to live in peace and security can be established. But don't underestimate the painful compromises and sacrifices that will need to be made from both sides. And indeed, as you say, Israel started making back in August of this year.
And we've got a news clip to go to now. Looks at this painful concession that Israel had to make in order to renegotiate or to open up negotiations with the Palestinians as Israel released 104 Palestinian prisoners with blood on their hands.
Peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians are set to go ahead in Washington after the Israeli cabinet approved the release of 104 Palestinian prisoners. The Palestinians had made the prisoner release a condition of restarting negotiations, which broke down in 2010. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that it was a difficult moment, but tough decisions had to be made for the good of the country. Netanyahu's ministers were divided over the issue.
Everybody feels bad about the idea of releasing the prisoners because this is a bunch of really hideous people with a terrible history, but we have to do what we have to do in order to make the peace process progress.
I think that Israel is not allowed to free those terrorists. that they killed the Jewish. And I think that we can negotiate with the Palestinians without those horrible things.
The prisoner release has provoked strong responses among the Israeli public, with a protest against the move held in Jerusalem. The head of one terror victims association blasted U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry for his role in bringing Israel and the Palestinians back to the negotiating table.
It's a shame to the American nation that Kerry is making his career on the back of the families who lost a loved one. It's a shame for the American nation that the negotiation with the Palestinians and the Islamic organization are starting by releasing terrorists first.
The Palestinian prisoners will be released in 4 stages over the next several months as peace talks continue. Netanyahu has also said that any potential peace deal with the Palestinians will be put to a referendum.
That'll give you some idea of the high cost that Israel has to pay for peace. Be willing to actually release Palestinian prisoners responsible for terrorist attacks that have killed and maimed Israelis. Also, we're looking at September 2013, and this September 2013 marked the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords between Yitzhak Rabin of the Israeli Prime Minister and Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And we also saw the 40th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War as well during that month. Also came into October as well. What do you think the legacy of Oslo has been 20 years on?
Well, I mean, I suppose, strictly speaking, the legacy is the creation of the Palestinian Authority. I think a lot of the legacy, a lot of the good work of Oslo was undone by the madness of the Second Intifada, when suicide bombers were entering into Israeli towns and cities and causing some of the murder and mayhem, which some of those prisoners may have been associated with. So, however, I think the positive legacy has been the coalition around a two-state solution. I think ultimately we will see peace in the Middle East when Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. That's what Oslo sought to achieve, and the legacy is that mission, that dream continues, and hopefully we'll live to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see, I think we'd all love to see peace in the Middle East, but I think there are some major obstacles that have to be removed in order for there to be a genuine peace, and that needs to be a kind of entire grassroots movement amongst the Palestinians, that they accept Israel's right to exist, end to the incitement in their schools, media and education system, and also coming to a realization that that so-called Palestinian right of return is not feasible, as Israel also had to absorb over 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands. So in fairness, once they really come to a place where there is a genuine peace agreement, then I think we can say.
I mean, peace is more than the absence of war, and peace will have to happen between the peoples. But I think you're entirely right, and it needs to be prepared for that. And you refer to, for example, the incitement that still goes on in the Palestinian Authority, officially sanctioned, officially sponsored in terms of textbooks, which don't even recognise that Israel's there, and in parts of the Arab world, which is some of the vile anti-Semitism. I mean, you touched upon earlier about the plight of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. The religious intolerance, which is a mild word for it, the persecution of Christians in parts of the Middle East, and the acceptability of anti-Semitism are things I think need to be tackled head on before there can be a real and lasting peace.
Absolutely. And in September we saw the hideous terrorist attack in Westgate Mall in Nairobi in Kenya by the Somali Islamist-based terrorist organisation Al-Shabaab.
Indeed, and there was a connection there with Israel, as certainly where the attack was started was an Israeli-owned business, and there's Israeli involvement in the mall itself, and Israeli security professionals were also helped in the operation. But of course, one of the uniquely chilling things about this was the so-called White Widow, who was a British expat who was alleged to be involved in this. And what we've seen throughout 2013, throughout the year, particularly in Syria, is the exporting of jihadists to some of these trouble spots. There are believed to be many hundreds such foreign jihadis in Syria alone. Many of them, some reports say the largest single group within that is British jihadists. And when these conflicts finish, or when these people tire, there's a possibility that they can and do return to the UK with all the with the ideology of hatred that they've taken on, and all the skills of terror and warfare that they've learned, which is a strategic security concern for us here.
And we got a news clip to go to now that looks at this hideous terrorist attack at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi in Kenya in September.
The British Foreign Office is reportedly investigating claims that a female British terror suspect known as the White Widow could be linked to the shopping centre massacre in Kenya. A white woman wearing a veil was allegedly spotted shouting orders in Arabic to the gunmen during the attack on the Westgate complex in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Some reports in the British media have claimed the woman is Samantha Luthwaite, the English widow of 7/7 bomber Jermaine Lindsay, and apparently wanted by Kenyan police over links to a suspected terrorist cell. However, Al-Shabaab, the Islamist terror group who police say carried out the siege, have denied that any of the militants involved are from the UK or US. Between 10 and 15 attackers are still inside the Westgate shopping centre holding an unknown number of hostages. Kenyan security sources say that an army assault is underway, with Israeli and American agents reportedly assisting with the operation to free the remaining people that were taken hostage on Saturday.
As we saw with the Westgate terror siege at the mall in Nairobi, that international terrorism has found a new centre, and that's in Africa. Moving on very quickly to October and November of 2013, and in October 2013 we saw the renewal of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks sponsored by US Secretary of State John Kerry, and we also saw for the first time the renewed peace negotiations over Iran's nuclear weapons program with the 5+1 members of the UN Security Council and Iran, that resulted in a deal in November, and this is the outcome.
This agreement has made the world a much more dangerous place. I know that many share the concern of Israel, especially in the region, and there's a reason for this. For years, the international community has demanded that Iran cease all uranium enrichment. Now, for the first time, the international community has formally consented that Iran continue its enrichment of uranium. And this is in direct contravention of UN Security Council resolutions. So Israel is not bound by this agreement. We cannot and will not allow a regime that calls for the destruction of Israel to obtain the means to achieve this goal. We will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapons capability.
And the issue of Iran's nuclear weapons program is certainly Israel's biggest security concern for 2014. This is a deal that the Europeans and the Americans brokered with Iran, but still allowed Iran to continue their enrichment of uranium, and also meant a huge easing, anywhere between $6 and $10 million of easing of sanctions against the regime. And Israel's very, very concerned because the Israeli government feels that now Iran's been let off the hook, and there's now nothing to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons.
Indeed. I mean, there's a lot of technical detail in this deal, and talk about enrichment and centrifuge and so on. But put simply, what this deal didn't do is it didn't dismantle or set back or do anything to stop Iran developing a nuclear bomb. What it did simply was pause on some key areas, what Iran committed to pause what it was doing for 6 months, or to sort of churn it through. So, as you can see from the news clip, the Israeli Prime Minister's concern and anger at this deal, because it was hailed as somehow ending Iran's nuclear program, which it doesn't do anything to do with at all. At the end of 6 months, as then the hope of the UK and the other powers who agreed it was then they'll get to what they call a full deal, which will do that. However, in the meantime, nothing's stopped, nothing's put back, nothing's achieved, and Iran will continue to enrich low-grade uranium. It'll continue to build a plutonium reactor. It will continue to develop the weapons and delivery systems that it's been delivering, and over a number of years, in complete defiance of the international community.
And now we're on to December 2013, and Israel was hit by the biggest snowstorm to hit Israel in over 60 years.
Israel is facing another freezing night with fears of icy roads nationwide. Much of Jerusalem and northern Israel remain in deep snow, and the authorities are working to open roads in and out of the capital. 4 Israelis were known to have died since the storms began Wednesday night. Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat has said his municipality was still working in a state of emergency, grappling with a storm of extraordinary proportions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a once-in-a-century storm and said efficient coordination had averted the kind of loss of life that other countries had suffered in similar circumstances.
As here in Britain, we like to have snow at Christmas, so it can be a white Christmas, but it looks like Israel is facing, or would face, a white Christmas. We're down to the last minute or so, so I have to ask you, Dermot, what are the challenges facing Israel and the Jewish community in 2014?
I think we've touched them all in this programme. There is the ongoing and ever need for the talks between Israelis and Palestinians. There is the threat from Iran. It's make or break for Iran. We've got to see put their money where their mouth is, and if they deliver on that. And you've got the tensions in the rest of the region, Syria and Egypt primarily. Egypt, the largest, most important Arab country, that they get some stability there. And in Syria, the ongoing slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, cannot be allowed to continue. And of course, there's a concern that may flow over into Israel's borders.
Dermot, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest as we've looked back at 2013. So I want to wish you and your family a Happy New Year.
Thank you, Simon. I look forward to seeing you in 2014.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for watching today's Middle East report as we've looked back at some of the events that have shaped Israel and the Middle East in 2013. And you can be sure that 2014 will provide a challenge for Israel and the Jewish people, with the ongoing civil war in Syria, Iran edging ever closer to developing nuclear weapons, which would be a game changer in the Middle East, as well as things that are happening in Egypt, plus also the rise of anti-Semitism. So keep watching the Middle East report in 2014 to know what's happening in Israel and the Middle East. So I want to wish you a very Happy New Year for 2014.